Silhouette of a cowboy herding cattle against a sunset, evoking the early ranching days. In the rolling grasslands of British Columbia's Okanagan Valley, a pioneering ranching legacy took root over 150 years ago. O'Keefe Ranch, founded in 1867, stands as a living testament to the grit, vision, and community spirit of the Old West, Canadian style. This is the story of how a young adventurer named Cornelius O'Keefe and his partners turned open range into a thriving ranch, overcoming frontier challenges and building a heritage that endures to this day. We'll journey through its colorful history, from the wild gold rush days in cattle drives, through the boom of a ranching empire, to the modern operations that keep this rich history alive. The stage for O'Keefe Ranch's founding was set by events far to the north. In 1858, gold was discovered in the Cariboo region of British Columbia, igniting a frenzy of prospectors flocking to the area. Few struck it rich in gold, but all those miners needed to eat, creating a huge demand for beef in the remote gold fields. Between 1858 and 1868, they drove over 22,000 head of cattle up from the United States along the Okanagan Valley to feed the hungry miners in BC's interior. The Okanagan Valley, then a vast rolling expanse of bunch grass and sagebrush, became a natural cattle corridor. At that time, British colonial officials were keen to secure the frontier by encouraging settlers to stay. The government offered land for as little as $1 per acre, promoting the myth that this fertile valley was wild and empty. In reality, it was the ancestral territory of the Syilx Okanagan indigenous people, and no treaties had been signed. Into this landscape rode a young man named Cornelius O'Keefe, chasing a dream not of gold, but of grass and cattle. In June of 1867, Cornelius O'Keefe, along with partners Thomas Wood and Thomas Greenhow, drove a herd of cattle into the North Okanagan. These three cowboys arrived at the head of Swan Lake, just north of present-day Vernon, BC, and couldn't believe their luck. Before them spread rich green grasslands and a reliable water source, ideal range for cattle. Seizing the chance, each man preempted 160 acres of land on the spot, the maximum allowed per person at the time. It was 1867, notably the same year Canada became a country, and these were among the very first European settlers in the Okanagan Valley. Thomas Wood didn't stick around long. By 1871, he relocated to start a ranch elsewhere, but Cornelius O'Keefe and Thomas Greenhow stayed, forming a lasting partnership on their adjacent homesteads. Setting up a homestead from scratch in a new land was no easy task. Legend has it that Cornelius O'Keefe liked to tell his children that on the first rainy day on his new ranch, he built himself a chair, perhaps one of the few comforts he had in those early days. There were no buildings at first, just open range. The two partners likely threw up basic log shelters and corrals to begin carving a ranch out of the wilderness. Crucially, O'Keefe and Greenhow did not do it all alone. Like many frontier settlers far from home, both men turned to local indigenous women for companionship and guidance. Cornelius O'Keefe entered into a common-law marriage with an Okanagan woman named Alapetsa, also known as Rosie, and Greenhow lived with a Syilx woman named Marianne. These women helped the newcomers adapt to the land, teaching survival skills, building relationships with First Nations communities, and raising families. O'Keefe and Alapetsa had 2 children together, cementing an alliance with the Okanagan people that proved valuable in those early years. In fact, having an indigenous wife gave Cornelius insight and some acceptance in the local community. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. In 1873, O'Keefe staked an additional land claim that overlapped Okanagan reserve lands, causing a serious dispute. After lengthy negotiations, that particular parcel was returned to the First Nations, a reminder that the ranch's early growth came amid tensions over land rights. As more settlers arrived, O'Keefe and Greenhow, like nearly all of their contemporaries, eventually distanced themselves from their indigenous families, marrying white women later on. But in those foundational years, Rosie and Marianne's contributions were invaluable, bridging cultures and helping the ranch survive. With fertile land and plenty of open range, O'Keefe and Greenhow focused on building up their cattle herd. They had started with about 180 head of cattle they'd driven up from Oregon, and now they let their stock graze and multiply on the abundant grass.
Yet the late 1860s and early 1870s brought uncertain markets. The gold rush boom that had demanded so much beef was fading, and suddenly cattle prices dropped. Rather than give up, the partners proved resourceful. They diversified their operations and turned the ranch into a community hub. By 1870, Cornelius O'Keefe and Thomas Greenhow established a small general store on the ranch, catering to the few settlers and to the local indigenous people in the Okanagan who had limited access to trade goods. In 1872, this modest store gained a grand distinction. It became the site of the valley's first post office, with O'Keefe himself serving as postmaster. Given that O'Keefe Ranch sat at the very end of the wagon road into the Okanagan, the new post office also turned the ranch into the terminus of the British Columbia stage line, meaning stagecoaches would come right up to O'Keefe Ranch to drop off mail and passengers. Imagine weary travelers and cowboys arriving by stagecoach, grateful to find at O'Keefe's a hot meal, a blacksmith to fix a wagon wheel, and maybe a bed of straw for the night. The ranch was becoming a little frontier settlement of its own. Over the years, O'Keefe built a remarkable array of facilities on his land. The ranch eventually boasted a blacksmith shop, a grist mill for grinding grain, a church, a cemetery, and of course, the general store and post office. Cornelius was effectively founding a village, providing services that attracted more families to settle nearby. St. Anne's Church, for example, was built on the ranch in 1889. It still stands today as one of the first churches in the Okanagan North. The ranch's blacksmith shop shod horses and repaired tools from miles around. O'Keefe even opened a hotel, or stopping house, for travelers. His original log house often hosted guests, including an overnight visit in 1882 from Canada's Governor-General, the Marquis of Lorne. All these enterprises made O'Keefe Ranch the social and economic center of the region in the late 19th century. Cowboys, settlers, and First Nations folks alike would come to O'Keefe's store for supplies and news. The post office connected the ranching community to the wider world for the first time. Cornelius O'Keefe had a reputation for hard work and hospitality, and his ranch became a well-known haven. By 1876, through reinvesting store and mill earnings, he had expanded his land holdings to 960 acres of prime pasture. In 1877, Cornelius made a big life change. He traveled back to Ontario and married Mary Ann McKenna, a school teacher from his hometown. He brought his new bride out west to the ranch, where they started a large family, eventually 9 children, 5 sons and 4 daughters, over the coming years. One can imagine Mary Ann's adjustment from urban Ontario to rustic ranch life. A log cabin home, indigenous and Chinese ranch hands about, more on that soon, and stagecoaches arriving periodically with strangers. She adapted, and the O'Keefe Ranch continued to prosper and grow as a true family-run ranch.
The 1880s were boom years for O'Keefe Ranch. 2 big developments ensured that: the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, across British Columbia, and the general growth of settlement in the Okanagan. When the CPR construction crews were building the railway through the interior, early 1880s, ranchers like O'Keefe suddenly had a hungry new market right at their doorstep: beef to feed railway workers, and later an easy way to ship cattle to faraway markets. The depression that followed the gold rush lifted, and Cornelius's fortunes improved dramatically as the railway came through. Once the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, previously isolated interior ranches gained rail access to coastal cities and to the burgeoning ranch country of Alberta, where breeding stock was in demand. O'Keefe's cattle could be sold farther afield for better prices, and the ranch thrived. At its peak in the mid-19th century, O'Keefe Ranch sprawled over roughly 12,000 acres of land. To put that in perspective, that's about 19 square miles of ranch, a vast spread of grazing land running along Okanagan Lake and surrounding hills. On these ranges, O'Keefe raised cattle, his mainstay, and also flocks of sheep, and cultivated large fields of wheat. Contemporary accounts describe thousands of head of livestock roaming the hills owned by O'Keefe.
It truly was one of the largest and most successful ranches in British Columbia at the time. With prosperity, Cornelius O'Keefe didn't remain in that humble log cabin. In the 1880s, he began constructing a proper Victorian-style mansion for his growing family. By 1886, the first wing went up, and by 1996, the grand O'Keefe mansion was completed with 13 rooms, fine furnishings, and even luxuries like a piano and imported china. This elegant house, quite a contrast to the rough cabins most ranchers had, symbolized O'Keefe's success. By then, he was not just a rancher, but also a community leader and a bit of a local magnate. Running such a spread took many hands, and O'Keefe was known to employ a diverse crew. Local Sioux, or Okanagan indigenous people, continued to work on the ranch. Some were likely expert cowboys and horsemen themselves, and Chinese workers were employed as well. In fact, the ranch had a dedicated Chinese cook's house on site for the Chinese staff who cooked for the O'Keefe family and ranch crew. This was a common practice on large ranches and in frontier towns of that era. Chinese immigrants often found work as cooks, gardeners, or general laborers. Life as a cowboy on the O'Keefe Ranch was similar to the American West. Long days on horseback, rounding up cattle, mending fences, and driving herds. Pay was low, and the work was dusty and hard, even if later legend painted it as romantic. As ranch curator Ken Mather once noted, the mystique of the untamed and romantic cowboy life was sometimes belied by the rough, low-paying life that they actually led. Still, for many young men, indigenous, Chinese, and European, the O'Keefe Ranch offered a place to prove oneself under the wide-open sky. Meanwhile, Cornelius O'Keefe himself was expanding his influence beyond the ranch. He took on roles like Justice of Peace, became a director of the BC Cattle Association, and even president of the local Vernon Jockey Club. His love of horses extended to horse racing. He was active politically, too, a stalwart of the Conservative Party in the region. By the end of the 19th century, Cornelius O'Keefe was truly an Okanagan cattle baron, with a prosperous ranch, a big family, and a name respected across the valley.
No boom lasts forever, and as the 1900s dawned, storm clouds gathered for the big ranches of the Okanagan. The very success of the region brought new challenges. Farmers discovered that the Okanagan's climate was ideal for growing fruit orchards, apples, peaches, grapes, and more. This new industry boomed in the early 1900s, and suddenly the expansive pasture lands were more valuable as farmland and town sites than as open range. The government and new investors started pressuring large landholders to subdivide and sell land for settlement, irrigation, and fruit growing. At the same time, the cattle business hit a downturn in the late 1890s. Beef prices fell, and years of heavy grazing had overgrazed some of the rangeland. The era of huge free-range ranches in that area was drawing to a close. Cornelius O'Keefe, ever the savvy businessman, held on as long as he could. He had already sold off some portions, about 3,000 acres, in the 1890s, but the tipping point came a few years later. In 1907, O'Keefe finally made the tough decision to sell the bulk of his remaining ranch to a land development company. He was one of the last of the Okanagan cattle barons to relinquish his range. It truly marked the end of an era. After 40 years, O'Keefe Ranch was no longer a giant 12,000-acre cattle kingdom, but would instead evolve into smaller farms and orchards, like the rest of the valley. Life also changed drastically for Cornelius on the personal front. His beloved wife Mary Ann had passed away in 1899, leaving him a 63-year-old widower with 8 of their 9 children still living. Wasting little time, O'Keefe returned to Ontario and in January 1900 married Elizabeth Tierney, a woman much younger than he. Interestingly, the O'Keefe and Tierney families had known each other back in Ontario. Cornelius and Elizabeth had another 6 children together in the following years. Yes, Cornelius fathered a total of 17 children in his lifetime, when you include the 2 with Rosie, 9 with Mary Ann, and 6 with Elizabeth. He was 76 years old when his last child was born. By the early 1910s, one could find the patriarch, Cornelius O'Keefe, strolling in the town of Vernon, doting on his youngest kids, and reflecting on a very full life. With most of his land sold, Cornelius stayed busy in semi-retirement. He invested in real estate in the nearby towns, buying up town lots in Vernon, and even building a couple of movie theaters in Vernon and Kamloops, a true sign of changing times. He remained a respected community figure and a local historian of sorts, often sharing yarns of the old days with anyone who'd listen. On May 27, 1919, Cornelius O'Keefe died at the age of 80 in the same gracious ranch house he had built decades before. With his passing, the pioneer chapter of O'Keefe Ranch came to a close, but the story was far from over. Thanks to his family's dedication, the ranch's legacy would enter a whole new phase.
After Cornelius's death, the remaining ranch property, much reduced in size, went to his third wife, Elizabeth O'Keefe. Elizabeth and the children continued to live on the homestead and do some ranching on a smaller scale. But finances were tight and the glory days were past. Over the ensuing decades, the O'Keefe family worked hard just to maintain the old homestead. By the 1960s, however, Cornelius O'Keefe's achievements were being recognized as an important piece of history. The centennial of both Canada, 1867-1967, and of the ranch itself sparked an idea: turn the O'Keefe homestead into a heritage site open to the public. Cornelius's son Tierney O'Keefe, from the Elizabeth generation, and Tierney's wife Betty took up this mission. In 1967, exactly 100 years after the ranch's founding, they opened the doors of the family home and property as Historic O'Keefe Ranch, inviting visitors to step back in time. This was truly a labor of love. Imagine keeping a sprawling old ranch property with its weathered buildings and antiques intact and presentable to the public. For about 10 years, the O'Keefe family ran the ranch as a private heritage attraction. They brought in school tours, hosted community events, and preserved a treasure trove of artifacts and heirlooms from the ranch's heyday. In 1977, the O'Keefe family finally passed the torch. The ranch was sold to the Devonian Group of Charitable Foundations, a philanthropic organization built on the oil fortune of Canadian millionaire Eric Harvey. The Devonian Foundation's goal was to save historic sites like this, but not to run them long-term. So in a noble gesture, Devonian handed O'Keefe Ranch over to the city of Vernon for $1 with the condition it be preserved in perpetuity as a historic site. The city of Vernon, in turn, works with the O'Keefe Ranch and Interior Heritage Society, a nonprofit group, to operate the site. In other words, the ranch is now a public trust, a museum without walls, where the dusty streets and old barns themselves are the exhibits. This transition ensured that O'Keefe Ranch would never be lost to subdivisions or neglect. It also injected new resources to restore buildings, catalog artifacts, and create educational programs. The site received thousands of artifacts, including 2,500 items that originally belonged to the O'Keefe family: letters, furniture, clothing, tools, you name it. Many of these have been carefully archived and even digitized for future generations to study. The property, about 50 acres today, retains several original structures from Cornelius's time and has added other period buildings relocated from around the region to enrich the historical experience.
A heritage interpreter in period costume welcomes visitors at O'Keefe Ranch, with historic buildings and farm animals on site. Fast forward to the present. What's it like at O'Keefe Ranch today? In short, it's a vibrant living history museum that offers something for everyone, especially those curious about ranching life. Each year from roughly May through October, the ranch opens its doors to the public, drawing tourists, history enthusiasts, and families, including 2,000 to 3,000 school children on field trips who come to learn and have fun. The experience is hands-on and immersive. As you wander the grounds, you'll encounter costumed interpreters, heritage buildings, and even the sights and sounds of farm animals, just as it would have been in the 1800s. Today, O'Keefe Ranch's attractions showcase both its original heritage and the broader ranching history of the region. Historic buildings preserved or recreated on site. Visitors can tour the original 1870s log cabin where Cornelius and his family first lived, then compare it to the opulent O'Keefe mansion completed in 1896, which is filled with original Victorian furnishings, including a 115-piece set of fine Meissen porcelain and a grand piano. St. Anne's Church, built 1889, still stands, as does the O'Keefe family cemetery, where Cornelius is buried. There's a replica general store. The original 1870 store post office was torn down in 1919, but a faithful reproduction built in the 1960s lets you step inside a frontier shop. You can even peek into the humble Chinese cook's house, a tiny bunkhouse from around 1890 where the ranch's Chinese cook slept, and the cowboy bunkhouse, which shows how ranch hands lived in the 1940s. Each of these interactive activities turns a visit into time travel. The ranch's former Greenhow family home is now the Greenhow Museum, filled with artifacts of frontier life, from authentic clothing and saddles to old firearms and farm tools. In an upper gallery, hobbyists from the North Okanagan Railroaders have created an intricate model railway exhibit depicting historic train stations and landscapes in miniature, a delightful nod to the importance of the railroad that once helped O'Keefe Ranch thrive. There's also the Pioneer Power Farm Equipment display, where vintage tractors and steam engines are showcased. On special event days, these old machines roar to life and even offer wagon rides around the ranch. No ranch is complete without animals, and O'Keefe Ranch keeps a menagerie of heritage breeds. You'll meet Nigerian dwarf goats that are famously friendly. In fact, the ranch runs popular goat yoga classes where visitors do yoga stretches while goats climb around. A small breed of cow called Zebu also lives here. Their bull Razzle and cow April charm visitors from a safe distance due to Razzle's big horns. Chickens cluck in their coop and horses graze in the pastures, representing the vital role of horses for transportation and ranch work back in the day. All these animals make the ranch feel alive and offer a tangible connection to its ranching roots. O'Keefe Ranch has become a community gathering place again, just as it was in Cornelius's era. In the fall, they host a harvest pumpkin festival with corn mazes and a haunted house in the old log buildings. At Christmas, the ranch might be decked out with lights and feature sleigh rides. They've hosted outdoor concerts, rodeo demonstrations, and even vintage car shows on the grounds. People can book the charming historic church for intimate weddings or even go glamping, glamorous camping, in furnished tents on the ranch to experience a night under the Okanagan stars. With a restaurant on site and facilities for events, the ranch beautifully blends its historic atmosphere with modern hospitality. All of this is run by a dedicated team of staff and volunteers through the nonprofit society, a labor of love that keeps the ranch's legacy thriving for future generations.